Now, I guess I wanted to start, in case I ran out of time, by just sort of saying how I sort of see the situation in general politically around the national standards and to some extent the RAINS research as well. And that is that, you know, we can look at some positives that after, that we haven't, for example, got after 2, 3, 4 years now of the after the national standards were launched, that we haven't got very obvious kind of league tables in the paper. We've certainly got school data on the Education Counts website. But here's a quote from Russell Brown, for example, saying that you know, things could be worse, and that if there hadn't been the pushback from people in schools and others who are concerned about the national standards, that we would have seen league tables and so on by now. And I was also quite pleased with this statement in an editorial recently, Herald on Sunday, and it talks about the fact that if you really want to know about a school, you need to go and visit the school and see what's going on. And in particular, it says the internal assessment involved with the NCEA and their different assessments used for national standards make tables and data associated with them unsuitable as a best school guide. Now, I think in many ways that is a triumph after several years of national standards for you know, the newspapers to, at least some of the time, be saying this kind of thing. On the other hand, I'm not sure if you can see this, this is from the Stuff website. This is the Minister basically dismissing the RAINS research on the grounds that it is a study of only 6 schools, and that it was, the wording is that it's paid for by the NZEI, who have a public position of opposing national standards. Now, from my point of view, this doesn't stand up, because although it is a small study, in terms of the numbers of schools, the ministry has used many small studies to you know, gather data about the New Zealand education system. And it's a very detailed study, actually, of those 6 schools. For example, there are 468 interviews, many of them repeated over time, to see what's going on in the schools with parents, with children, teachers, principals, board members, and so on. So there's plenty of rich detail to understand how the culture of the schools is changing. And of course, you know, the ministry, all the ministry funded research is, after all, funded by the key government that has a public position of supporting national standards. So, you know, where do you go with that kind of thing? At the end of the day, we have to look at the quality of the research and the arguments that are being made, I think. So that's, I guess, on the downside. And what concerns me is that unless there is continuing resistance to the national standards in terms of recognising some of the things I'm going to talk about, the lack of consistency across the country and so on, then the logic of the numbers will take over. Okay, and I think we can see this starting to happen. Last year, press releases came out from a whole lot of national MPs, and they said, they all said the same thing. It was sort of a joint press release, if you like. I'm happy to see, and say, I don't know, 82% of students in the so-and-so region achieved the national standards in reading. While these are great results, we want to see our primary students do even better, and this data will help schools to focus resources to better support kids. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that over time, unless there are continuing messages that the national standards are a problem, then we're going to see more and more people nodding their heads. Yes, they should be doing better. You know, we should be getting them up to 84% or 85%, and basically taking seriously a set of neat tables in the newspapers and so on. Perhaps not exactly in the form of a league table, but nevertheless some figures as part of the public achievement information approach. And that the data will take on a logic of its own in the same way that PISA data has, and so on. And that's the concern, really, that unless we have continued concern and resistance about the national standards, that actually they will become embedded in the national psyche, if you like. And the other thing is we've got discussion of national standards being used in the investing in educational success policy. I don't know where that's going to. You know, I'm not party to those discussions and to what extent national standards will figure, but it's a pretty good chance that it's a major investment by government that they will be in there somewhere. And certainly this is from a Federation flyer, and they're talking about wider measures of school quality and so on. But still we have this problem with the underpinning national standards and you know, where does what is given emphasis, if you like. And also it has been mentioned that, again from a recent flyer, that the PACT tool, the Progress and Consistency tool, which is this kind of online platform that helps teachers to make an overall teacher judgment against the national standards, that is continuing to go ahead as well. So on the one hand, yes, I think we've had some successes. On the other hand, the whole regime, if you like, is continuing to push forward, and I don't sort of see, unless there is a continuing resistance to that, I think that's going to be very difficult to stop. Now, 3 reports, range reports, and I just want to say a little bit from each one, and I won't have time to go into any of the detail, but they're all online, you can pick them up. The first one really was a scene-setting report, and what it emphasised was that schools come at the national standards from a whole range of perspectives and approaches that relate both to the sort of children that they're working to and the sort of social context that they are located within, the communities they're located within, and also what I call in the reports of their trajectories. In other words, where they've been going to over the preceding years, the sort of historical pattern of curriculum and assessment development and so on in the schools. And what I suggest to you is that these things are incredibly powerful, and that it is an incremental approach essentially to the national standards. The process of enacting them within schools, I don't use the word implement, the process of enacting them in the schools where they are reinterpreted and worked upon depends very much on these kind of contexts and trajectories, and the policies are worked in with what the school is already doing and has been doing over long periods of time. So there's no, it's not exactly not being able to move a super tanker. Schools are not like super tankers, but they're not like little nimble yachts either. They tend to move pretty much from a position that they have been going for some time. The key point about the second report was that there is enormous variability then, leading on in some ways from the context and from the trajectories, but enormous variability in how schools are going about the national standards and their underpinning overall teacher judgments. Basically the process is that teachers make a judgment based on a whole lot of data, and there's about 20 pages in the second report, and it just runs through all the sources of variability that we could find between the 6 schools in the study, and they range from sort of national and regional sources of variation, like ambiguities in the policy itself and the wording, like working towards, you know, what does that mean sort of thing, differing professional development opportunities across the country, imagine urban-rural differences, for example. The fact that the ministry, at least initially, was really pleased just to have people having some involvement in the national standards. They weren't looking at what was going on in terms of how the categories were being generated and how rigorous it was. Difficulties around advice, like for example senior advisors that just keep changing, and so you're dealing with this sort of constant turnover of people advising and people getting different advice from different sources and so on. And then the reporting itself, which is in a very crude template. Schools constantly want to write little footnotes and write little bits underneath about particular kids and their transients and what's happened to them and so on, but they can't do that because in the end it has to be translated into the tables that we sort of see on the PAI, so you can't get into that. But that is just kind of what's going on nationally and regionally. When you get into the school level, then it absolutely blossoms all this range of variability as you might expect. So you've got those differences in trajectories, but schools are also framing the national standards differently, they're defining the categories differently, they're matching them differently to curriculum levels. The data being sent off to the ministry represents quite different sorts of things in different schools. Some schools have it highly formalised, their processes, others it's much more relaxed and more or less, bring me your national standards judgments, your overall teacher judgments, how much discussion there's even been within the school, whether the senior leadership team is intervening or just letting the teachers get on with it, how much it's about formal testing as against other forms of assessment, the type of assessment tools and so on, it goes on. And even right down to children's practices. For example, in some classes, children are much more in a position where they can help each other with assessment tasks. And others, that's not the case. And of course, the ministry has focused on that one towards the bottom, the differences in teacher judgments. They've got the sort of idea that if you just work on the teachers and how they make the overall teacher judgment, then that will fix the problem. But actually there's all of this other stuff going on as well. So basically it's not remotely apples with apples. There are over 2,000 primary and intermediate schools in the country. There are over 2,000 significantly different versions of the national standards going on. That's my reading of the situation, based on the 6 differences between the 6 schools that we looked at. And of course, to some extent, the political differences between the schools. I like this photo. There's the national standards on that poster at the back there. It's about 10 centimetres off the floor, and it's kind of way back at the back of the classroom. And so this teacher can say, this is how teachers deal with policy a lot of the time. Well, I've got that poster in my classroom, but it's not exactly front and foremost, is it? And the guitar in the front with indications of which chords to. But then again, some schools take it very seriously, and here is a data wall. These data walls have kind of started to creep up in some schools. This was at Kanuka School, largely sort of bicultural school in the sense of about 70% Māori. And the cars have children's names on them, and these little white tags represent the national standards, and these are math stages that are being dealt, and it actually goes much wider than this. This is just a section of it. So of course you can imagine if your car is up the front of the motorway, you might be somewhat happier than if it's down the back. And some of these data walls very explicitly position and label the children. For example, there's a category in the national standards well below, and in one of the classrooms that I went into, there was a chart, and it was full of bar graphs, okay, and there was, I think only one was well below, and of course they're colour-coded, so it stood out like a sore thumb that this particular child was well below compared to all the others. And we see variations on this. There are balloons floating up into the sky. There are skateboard ramps. I'm not saying it's become common, but you're certainly starting to see this kind of thing growing up as schools are trying to represent the national standards and where children are at with them. Now, what I argue in this third report, which Michelle White and I wrote, was that over time we are seeing some convergence across the schools, even though, despite their different backgrounds and so on, and that they are basically falling into line with the national standards. And one school, that's Magenta, a rural school, and I'll perhaps come back to that a little bit, not so much, but certainly the others. And I think there are a variety of reasons for this. And one of them's got to do with sort of professional identities. That, for instance, at Seagull School, middle-class suburban school that was in the study, there was very much the view that, well, we don't really want to do the national standards, but if we're going to do them, we'll do them well. And there was that kind of part of their professional identity was important, I think, in them sort of starting to take up the national standards. And similarly, I think it's difficult for school leaders to say to their staff, well, I don't really agree with the national standards, but I want you to get on with them and do them anyway. It sets up a sort of dissonance, if you like. It doesn't help leadership. And it's much easier, in fact, for the school leader to say, well, we will find a good way through the national standards. And so, you know, you've got accounts from the schools that they have nice national standards. Other schools kind of have bad national standards. We've got nice ones. And so that's all tied up with that. There was pressure from central agencies. There was, the ministry put out some 78J letters early on that basically put pressure on schools that were not falling into line with the national standards. There have also been ERO is increasing its monitoring of schools around the national standards. I have to say, again, going back to the weakness of some of that for instance, Kānuka was a good example. That school wasn't, one of the reasons it was relatively supportive of the national standards was that it didn't use the well below category at all. It only had below, at and above. It didn't use well below, and then it eventually got told by the ministry it needed to do that. But it was interesting that ERO never picked up the fact that it wasn't using well below, and that is such a key, part, I guess, of the national standards is the 4 categories. I think too that there is this kind of creep, this sort of discursive or cultural creep where what wasn't possible a couple of years ago becomes possible. So there's that kind of sense of incrementalism. And also schools are unevenly affected, so that the senior school, for example, might have more of an impact of national standards and the junior school don't quite get what's going on there. So all of this is helping it to find its way into schools. I don't think there's a lot of pressure from the league tables, if you like, the release of data, as perhaps was anticipated. Magenta is a school that was under pressure, but in a kind of a special case there, that a rural school where the principal argued that the community were very aspirant and would happily take their children out and put them into private schools if they got a whiff of the local school going down in terms of its education quality, so that a dropping back of national standards results there would make a difference. But the other schools, that they weren't particularly interested in right up until last year. I think that national standards are having some favourable impact, and why shouldn't they? Even a bad policy can have some good effects. The impact of policy is complex, and some of the things that we might point to is and have been pointed to by people through the research are the understanding of curriculum levels, that it's required teachers to engage more with those. And that some teachers and some children, and the emphasis is on the some, have been motivated by the national standards, and there's been some improved targeting of interventions for particular kinds of kids. I mean, it doesn't necessarily point to children who are well below or above getting much emphasis, but around the below at borderline, I think there's a lot of interest in schools and moving kids across that spectrum, if you like. And here's an example from a teacher at Kānuka, just saying, going back to the car display actually, and just saying, well, this is something that motivates the children, and that's why I do it, sort of thing. So there's a bit of that going on. However, I think much more damage overall, and it relates to the intensification of workloads. There's curriculum narrowing and the reinforcement of a 2-tier curriculum, and the positioning and labelling of children, and new tensions on school staff. So just a few of these things. The intensification of staff workloads, this really relates to the overall teacher judgment, and it's kind of like has created a life of its own. And it's like, how long is a piece of string? How much energy do you put into making an overall teacher judgment? And clearly where teachers are anxious about it, there's always the propensity or willingness to perhaps do another test or put in another piece of assessment. And we find that that schools are putting in, some schools, and I think that's the emphasis here, are putting enormous amounts of effort into making overall teacher judgments, and then the processes of moderating and checking and so on within the schools are absolutely enormous. And what I think you've got to see that in terms of opportunity cost, in terms of what they're spending their time on, because teachers only have limited time. Well, I think that's what's happening here is it's being made in high stakes, and that teachers are much more anxious about it than what they had been, and so they are using lots. It's creating an edifice, really, is what I'm saying, I guess. Then there's curriculum narrowing, and that takes a number of forms, focusing more on reading, writing and maths, which is what the national standards are in, but also within those areas, focusing more on the kinds of activities that work with the national standards, and also this idea of the two-tier curriculum. I think that internationally we see that lower socioeconomic schools tend to go into a back-to-basics approach with high-stakes assessment, and I think that is happening here too in schools like Cicada and Kānuka, which were a couple of schools in the study, lower socioeconomic schools. Because I think that in a middle-class schools, you're going to have a lot more children that are going to be relatively easily at or above anyway, based on their prior ability and their readiness for school and so on. What then happens is that those schools find time essentially for more engaging activities, and middle-class parents basically insist on there still being elements of creativity and so on in the curriculum, whereas in the lower socioeconomic schools in the study, they were being pushed back to making sure the kids were doing well in reading, writing and maths as well as they could. And unfortunately what you then get is a more direct approach into the national standards, not linking it into the wider, richer curriculum, which is often what hooks kids in, and essentially school becoming more boring, I would suggest to you, in those sorts of schools. I think that's the pattern we're going to see over time, and it certainly fits with the international literature. We've seen the positioning and labelling of children. I've just given you an example of that, but also just the whole business about, for example, teachers trying to tell parents about the progress of children and then finding that actually they're not listening. At parents' nights and so on, report nights, that parents are focused on the fact that their child has been found below. I'll have to get them a tutor. Not really being able to get past those categories and the authority of the categories to really talk about the progress of the child. And unproductive new tensions amongst school staff, the sort of thing where you can imagine what it's like as a teacher if your work is being constantly checked and rechecked and rechecked, and how that makes you feel about your professionalism and autonomy. The sort of thing about what if the teacher before you has said that a child is above and you decide that they're below or at, and the kind of relationship with parents and the school that sets up. What if one teacher gets a class that's going to be very easy to get through the national standards and another teacher gets a class that's not going to be very easy to get through? Those are the sorts of tensions. So I think all of this is happening despite attempts by teachers to kind of keep the temperature down and to minimise the damaging impact of the policy. So overall, my argument in the final report with Michelle is that we have to take this seriously, because this is just embryonic at this stage. It is still really, it's taken a long time really for the national standards to start to gather some momentum, and I think what we're going to see is these patterns getting stronger, and that we're not going to avoid the problems that were found internationally. That was the claim at the outset, that we'd taken a different path. What we're going to get is a variation on the theme, and I think particularly what we're going to see is a very burdensome approach around the overall teacher judgment. And there's a series of recommendations, but in particular getting rid of the 4-point scale and the language of that. And I'm keen on a national sampling approach, so that you don't get the kind of tail wagging the dog effect that you get with a sort of national testing or national standards approach. The perverse effects of the policy don't come to the fore. and at the bottom there is the web address if you want to read the reports and follow up. So, thank you.